Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I didn't notice it at first. Nobody did. The early days were loud and messy and familiar in the way disasters always pretend to be familiar. Ambulance sirens, hospital hallways crowded with people who were terrified but still human, the same tired jokes in the break room, the same coffee that tasted burn no matter who made it. If you asked me then what was happening, I would have said it was another spike of violence, another bad batch of something on the street, another wave of panic fueled by bad videos and worse rumours. I was wrong. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm a public health field investigator by training, the kind of person who gets sent out when a cluster of illnesses doesn't make sense and nobody wants to say outbreak out loud. I worked for a state-level agency based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but most weeks I lived out of a duffel bag and a laptop, driving to small towns for foodborne illness, nursing home flu clusters, lab audits, all the unglamorous work that keeps the wheels from coming off. That Tuesday started with a call that should have been routine. A hospital in Pittsburgh, UPMC Presbyterian, had reported a string of agitated delirium admissions overnight. The notes used every vague phrase doctors reach for when something doesn't fit. Altered mental status, severe confusion, combativeness. A few of the patients had bitten staff. One had tried to claw at his own throat like he couldn't breathe. Security had been called. Police had been called. Sedatives were used. The lab results weren't consistent with anything obvious. And quietly, there was a second pattern. The patients all came from different neighborhoods, but had all been through the same place in the previous 48 hours. PPG Paints Arena. There had been a concert, a sold-out event. Tens of thousands of people packed tight, singing and sweating and sharing air. Public health always notices crowds, because crowds are where the math changes. One sick person in a room is a problem. One sick person in an arena is a multiplier. I drove west on the Pennsylvania Turnpike with the radio low, listening to emergency scanner traffic in one ear and the hospital's clipped phone updates in the other. My co-worker, Tessa Liang, met me at the hospital entrance with a plastic badge and a face that said she'd skip sleep. "Not flu," she said as soon as she saw me. "Not drugs. At least not the ones we can find." "How many?" I asked. 27 in 12 hours. And that's just here. Mercy has some. West Penn has some. There are stories on social media about rabies people. Rabies. I hated that word because it made people imagine frothing mouths and Hollywood madness. Real rabies is cruel and quiet at first, and by the time the brain is involved, it's basically a countdown. But this wasn't rabies. The onset was too fast. The clustering was too weird. We walked through the emergency department with our identification turned outward, trying to look like we belonged there. Nurses had their hair tied back and their eyes narrowed. Security guards stood closer to the patient rooms than they normally would. The air smelled like disinfectant and tension. We were shown footage from a hallway camera, because people like me get shown footage when nobody can explain what happened using ordinary words. A man in a concert t-shirt had been rolled down the hall on a stretcher, his arms strapped because he'd been fighting. His eyes were open but not tracking. His jaw worked like he was chewing something invisible. A nurse leaned in to check his oxygen. In one sharp motion, he lunged, twisting against the straps with a strength that didn't match his build. He caught her forearm with his teeth and held on, not like a panicked bite, but like a clamp. When security pulled him off, he didn't thrash. He stared. He stared like he was watching them learn. "They're focused," the charge nurse said, voice low. "I know how that sounds. I've been here 20 years. People high on stimulants are chaos. Dementia patients are fear. This is different. They lock on." She didn't say what everyone was thinking, because there are words you don't say in a hospital hallway, unless you want the whole building to start vibrating with panic. We began the usual work, Interviews, timelines, contact lists. We got permission from the arena management to review security footage and point-of-sale logs. We pulled water quality records. We tried to connect threads. And all day, while we did that, more patients came in. By evening, the hospital had activated its internal emergency management plan, extra security, locked doors, a request for police presence. There was a conference call with state health. There were cautious words. Anomalous cluster, unknown etiology, recommend increased personal protective measures. Watch people reach for normal explanations like they were life rafts. A physician said it might be a new synthetic drug. A nurse said it might be some contaminated vape product. An administrator worried about public relations because that's what administrators do, even when a building is on fire. Then, at 9:40 p.m., the first death happened on camera. Not a gentle death. Not a slow fade behind a curtain. A patient went into cardiac arrest, and the resuscitation team rushed in, doing what they always do. Compressions, ventilation, the disciplined choreography of saving a life. The monitor showed no organized rhythm. They pushed medication. They worked. They called the time of death. I expected the room to become still, the way death usually forces stillness, even in a hospital. Instead, the patient sat up. It wasn't a movie sit-up. It wasn't dramatic. It was abrupt, like a puppet yanked by a string. The body's movements weren't graceful, but they weren't random either. The head lifted, turned, and the eyes found the nearest person. And then the patient moved. The nurse screamed. The crash cart toppled. The team backed away. The patient came off the bed with a kind of stumbling purpose and went for the door. Security tackled him. It took 3 guards. And even then the patient kept pushing, like a machine that hadn't received the message that it was supposed to be off. That's when someone finally said out loud the phrase I would hear everywhere for the rest of my life. They don't stay down. The next 12 hours were the hinge point. I didn't realize it at the time, because when you're inside the storm, you can't see the edge of it. But later, when I replayed the timeline over and over in my head, I would mark that night as the moment the world crossed from crisis into something else. At 3:15 a.m., Pittsburgh police radio traffic started to change. Calls about assaults became calls about multiple persons acting violently. Calls about disorderly conduct became calls about unknown medical. Ambulance dispatchers asked for law enforcement to stage until scene is secure. Hospitals called for more police. Police called for more units. More units weren't available. By sunrise, it was on the news. They used careful language at first. A series of violent incidents. Possible exposure event. Authorities are investigating. Time =0.6s. The footage did the rest. Shaky phone videos from downtown. A person stumbling into traffic. Another person running. Then stopping. Then turning back as if pulled by a magnet. People screaming. A crowd scattering. And in one clip, something that made my stomach go cold. 3 infected individuals. People who should have been separate. Random. Aimless. Moving together down a sidewalk. Not shoulder to shoulder like friends, but in a loose triangle. Each one's head turning independently. Scanning. That was the first time I saw it. New behavior. I spent that day inside a cramped emergency operations room at the county building. Because public health doesn't get to go home when the story breaks. We sat under fluorescent lights with bad coffee and listened to briefings. Police, fire, emergency medical services, hospital administrators, a representative from the state, a tired man from the federal government who introduced himself as being here to coordinate. At 11:20 a.m., a CDC liaison joined by video. She didn't give us a name for it because they didn't have one they were willing to release. She did, however, give us the first concrete guidance. Treat bodily fluids as infectious, use respiratory protection, avoid close contact, and, this was the line that made everyone in the room stop writing, assume post-mortem movement is possible. We asked about transmission, airborne, waterborne, bite-related. Nobody could say with certainty, but what we had, was obvious to anyone paying attention, was that bite incidents were overrepresented. That made sense in the grim way it always does. Violence is a shortcut for biology. Teeth break skin. Skin opens doors. By late afternoon, the governor issued a limited emergency declaration for Allegheny County. They asked people to stay home. They asked people not to travel. They asked people to remain calm. It wasn't enough. Words never are, once fear has momentum. That evening, the roads out of Pittsburgh turned into slow-moving lines of cars. Gas stations ran dry. Grocery stores were stripped. Social media filled with, "My cousin's friend says the military is coming, and they're lying to us, and this is the end." I tried to convince myself we could contain it. That was my job after all. Containment is a set of actions, a set of assumptions about human behavior and pathogen behavior, and I had been trained to believe systems would respond if the right people took the right steps. Then, just after midnight, I got a call from an emergency department physician at a smaller hospital outside the city. His voice was tight. "We have a patient who walked in," he said. "He's infected, but he's doing something." "What do you mean?" I asked, already moving, grabbing my coat. "He's not attacking. He's standing in the vestibule, just standing, like he's waiting." Waiting. Infection changes behavior. That's not new. Rabies increases aggression and biting. Some parasites change animal risk-taking. Viruses can make people cough more, sneeze more, spread more. But waiting isn't just behavior. Waiting implies strategy. Waiting implies restraint. I drove to the smaller hospital with Tessa in the passenger seat, the city lights behind us and the dark hills ahead. We passed cars parked odd angles on shoulders, abandoned in haste. We passed a bus pulled over with its doors open like it had exhaled passengers into the night. At the hospital, the vestibule doors were locked. A security guard watched from behind glass, sweaty and pale. Inside the vestibule, a man stood with his hands at his sides, breathing slow, eyes fixed on the interior door. He didn't look like the others. He wasn't smeared with blood or foam or anything cinematic. He looked like someone who'd gotten lost on the way home and stopped at a wrong building. The guard spoke through an intercom. "He just showed up," the guard said. "Walked right up, tried the door, stopped, then he just stood there." The man's head turned slightly, as if he'd heard the voice through the glass. His eyes didn't move like a normal person's eyes. They shifted in quick, snapping motions, scanning the interior of the lobby. Then he did something that made the hair on my arms lift. He stepped back. He stepped back into the shadow of the vestibule corner, where the overhead light didn't fully reach. He positioned himself so the interior door was still in view, but his body was less exposed. "He's hiding," Tessa whispered. "Or learning." We didn't open the door. We didn't engage. We documented. We called it in. We watched him for 30 minutes until, without warning, he walked away. Not wandering, not drifting, walking in a straight line toward the parking lot, toward the trees beyond. And when he reached the edge of the lot, 2 more figures emerged from behind a row of parked cars and fell into step with him, one behind, one to the side. A formation. They moved together into the darkness. That was the moment I stopped thinking of them as sick people and started thinking of them as a new kind of hazard. Not just unpredictable violence, not just chaos, something that could observe, adjust, and return later with intent. The first week was a blur of escalating failures. Hospitals locked down, then overflowed, then became their own disasters. Police tried to respond, then pulled back to protect stations and families. Fire departments stopped entering unknown scenes. The city issued curfews that nobody enforced consistently. The National Guard arrived in the way guard units always do, piecemeal, undertrained for the specific horror, trying to plug a dam with sandbags while the river rose. I spent those days moving between operations centers, shelters, and whatever building still had power. My badge got me into places, but it didn't protect me from what was happening. Nothing did. The infected spread outward along the same routes people used to flee. That's what made it so fast. People carried it unknowingly, and sometimes knowingly, because denial is a powerful drug. There were stories of families trying to restrain an infected loved one in a car, driving to a hospital 2 counties away, only to crash or stop at a gas station or call for help. Every interaction was an opportunity. But it wasn't just the spread that terrified me, it was the adjustments. By day 4, local police were reporting something new, infected individuals appearing near roadblocks, not charging them head-on, but hovering at the edges, watching. A patrol officer described it to me in words he clearly hated using. "They're not dumb," he said. "They don't run into the cones. They don't run into the lights. They hang back. And then, when somebody steps away from the line, when a driver gets out, or when we open a gap, they move." By day 5, there were confirmed cases of infected avoiding bright floodlights. It wasn't a fear response like a vampire story. It was more practical. Staying in shadow reduced visibility and reduced the chance of being targeted. That meant they had learned something about our behavior, even if they didn't understand the technology itself. By day 6, someone in a suburban neighborhood captured a video from an upstairs window that I watched again and again until the motion was burned into my mind. A group of infected, 8, maybe 10, stood in the street outside a house. The house was lit inside. There was movement behind curtains. The infected didn't slam into the door. They didn't scream. They didn't thrash. They waited. One of them walked to a parked car, leaned in, and, this part was hard to see, but it was there, pressed its palm against the car's alarm button on the key fob that had been left on the seat. The car alarm erupted into noise. The house's porch light turned on. Someone inside moved toward the front window. And that's when the group surged. Not randomly, not all at once. 2 moved to the front door. Others moved to side windows. 1 stayed back, watching the street. A coordinated breach. It was the first time I saw a pattern that looked like planning. I couldn't prove intent, not in a scientific way, not yet. But the functional outcome was the same. They were using noise to force a response, then exploiting the response. New behavior. That phrase became a curse inside our little team. Every day brought another example. Every day, the mental map of how to avoid them had to be redrawn. When the state government ordered a broader stay-at-home advisory, it was too late. The advisory was a suggestion. The infected didn't care about suggestions. By the second week, Pittsburgh was effectively split into pockets. Downtown, and some neighborhoods still had intermittent power from the grid, but the maintenance crews were not going into high-risk areas. Water pressure became unreliable. Cell service degraded, first from overload, then from tower failures and lack of fuel for backup generators. People moved from high-rise apartments into lower buildings, or tried to, until stairwells became traps. Our agency ordered us to relocate to a regional coordination site outside the city, a place with secure perimeter fencing and backup power, the Allegheny County Airport in West Mifflin. Not the big commercial airport, but the smaller one with private planes, hangars, and enough open space to stage. It was defensible in ways downtown wasn't. It had fuel on site, it had a control tower, it had the kind of chain link fencing that, while not magical, at least defined a boundary. We arrived with a convoy that included county emergency management, a few sheriff's vehicles, and a box truck loaded with supplies. Bottled water, meals, medical kits, radios. I carried my duffel and my laptop like they were talismans. At the airport, there were already people working, a mix of guard troops, county staff, and a handful of pilots and maintenance personnel who had nowhere else to go. The tower's windows looked out over the runway like a calm eye. The hangars echoed with footsteps and the distant rumble of generators. We were assigned a corner of a hangar as our workspace. folding tables, extension cords, a satellite phone that worked when clouds weren't thick, whiteboards with maps, a radio base station with a long antenna bolted to the wall. The first night felt almost safe. Then the perimeter alarm went off at 2:20 a.m. A guard shouted. Radios crackled. Floodlights snapped on, washing the fence line in harsh brightness. I ran with others toward the sound, my heart punching. At the fence, we saw them. Not a horde, not a chaotic wave. 6 infected, spaced out along the fence like points on a line. They weren't pressing against it. They weren't trying to climb. They were just there, facing inward, heads moving slightly as they watched the lights and the people. One of them stepped forward and pressed its hands against the chain link. It didn't yank. It didn't shake. It held steady. A guard soldier raised his rifle. An officer barked orders about rules of engagement, about not firing unless necessary, about conserving ammunition. Someone yelled for non-lethal options. And then, behind us, from the dark side of the hangar row, came a sharp crash. We turned, and for a split second I couldn't understand what I was seeing. A service door at the back of the nearest hangar had been forced open, not by accident, not by wind. The door was bent inward as if someone had leaned into it with body weight and patience. 2 infected came through, one after the other, moving fast. They had used the fence line as a distraction. The 6 at the fence hadn't been the attack. They'd been the lure. The real entry was elsewhere, through a weak point we hadn't considered at 2 in the morning. People screamed. A guard soldier fired. The sound inside the hangar was deafening, a hammer blow that bounced off metal walls. The infected didn't hesitate. One went down, not dramatically, but collapsing like its legs had been unplugged. The other kept moving, ignoring the noise, ignoring the chaos, heading toward the brightest cluster of people like it had been given a direction. A sheriff's deputy tackled it, trying to use his own body as a barrier. That was brave and stupid and human. The infected's jaw snapped forward, missing the deputy's shoulder by inches. The deputy shoved it back, face twisted, and another soldier grabbed the infected's arms from behind. It took 3 people to drag it out and pin it. In the aftermath, once the door was secured and the fence line cleared, I stood in the harsh floodlight and realized what the infected had done. They had tested the perimeter. They had found our attention response. They had exploited it. New behavior wasn't just happening out there in neighborhoods. It was happening at our own supposed safe place, in real time, against our tactics. The next morning, we held a meeting with everyone who mattered at the airport. Guard leadership, county emergency management, law enforcement, airport operations. The mood was not hopeful. It was practical, because practical is what you become when hope is too expensive. We reinforced doors. We moved vehicles to create barriers. We established a rule: never send everyone to one breach alarm. Always hold a reserve. Always assume distraction. And then we did what public health does, even when the world is collapsing. We tried to measure. We began documenting infected behavior systematically: time of day, response to light, response to sound, group size, spacing, apparent coordination, patterns of approach. We weren't just doing it for academic reasons. We needed predictive understanding. If they were changing, then every old assumption could become lethal overnight. By day 3 at the airport, we had multiple entries under D1. That was the one that scared people the most, because it meant their actions weren't just reactive, they were interactive. On day 4, we saw something new. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of pale winter light Pittsburgh gets when the sun is technically there but doesn't commit. A maintenance worker named Samir Patel was repairing a generator fuel line near the edge of the tarmac. Samir had been an aircraft mechanic before all of this. He had the calm hands of someone who can fix complex machines under pressure. He was working with 2 others when he froze and pointed toward the tree line beyond the airport boundary. A single infected stood there, partially concealed by brush. It wasn't moving toward the fence. It was just standing, head tilted. A guard soldier raised binoculars. "It's holding something," he said. I stepped closer, squinting. The distance was too far to see details, but the posture was strange. The infected's arms were bent as if it cradled an object. Then it threw. The object arced through the air and landed short of the fence. It was small and dark. A moment later, it made a sound, a soft, rhythmic beeping. Everyone went still. It was a handheld radio, a cheap one probably, the kind you can buy at a hardware store. The beeping was the low battery alert or the squelch tail, the kind of noise nobody notices until they're trying to be quiet. The infected watched the fence line, watched the people, watched for movement. It wasn't trying to get the radio back. It didn't care about the radio. It cared about what we would do. It had thrown bait. We didn't move. We didn't send anyone. We let it beep until the battery died. The infected stood there for 15 minutes, then turned and walked back into the trees. That was the first time I saw them use an object intentionally as a test tool, not just as a noise source from a car alarm. The implications hit me in a wave. If they could recognize that humans respond to certain sounds, and if they could carry and throw objects to create those sounds, then the range of possible tactics expanded dramatically. A week into our airport holdout, the world outside had become patchy. Some towns were quiet because they'd locked down early or because they'd been emptied. Some were loud with uncontrolled movement and violence. Rumors traveled faster than verified information, but some patterns were undeniable. The outbreak was no longer local. It was in Cleveland. It was in Columbus. It was in Philadelphia. It was in places you wouldn't expect. Small towns along highways where people stopped for gas and bathroom breaks. And everywhere, the same phrase began showing up in messages from responders and survivors. "They're acting different." One evening, an exhausted guard lieutenant sat across from me at a folding table and pushed a printed email toward me. The email was from a National Guard unit in eastern Pennsylvania. Observed behaviors: infected avoiding open areas during daylight, using tree lines and building shadows, infected congregating near road intersections, not randomly, but as if anticipating travel, infected demonstrating limited problem solving, including pushing against doors until hinges fail rather than striking glass. I read it twice, then looked up. "Intersections," I said. The lieutenant nodded grimly. "They're learning where people go," he said. "They don't chase every noise now. They wait at the places people have to pass." It made a terrible kind of sense. Predators in nature don't sprint randomly. They stake out water sources. They use funnels. They let prey come to them. We were watching something like that emerge, not because the infected were animals, but because whatever was driving them was selecting for effective behavior. The ones that rushed into gunfire and floodlights didn't last. The ones that stayed in shadow and waited did. Selection pressure, happening in real time. Public health doesn't usually have to think about selection pressure at a human scale. We think in weeks, months, seasons. But here it was, compressing into days. On day 10, we almost lost the airport. It started with silence. That's the part I remember most. We had grown used to constant distant noise, sirens, gunshots, helicopters, the low roar of the generator. That night, around 1 a.m., the outer world went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the air itself was listening. Tessa was on the tower stairwell landing with a radio, trying to get a faint signal from the county system. I was in the hangar, cataloguing notes by headlamp because we were conserving fuel and keeping interior lights low. A volunteer nurse slept with her back against a supply crate, boots still on. Then the perimeter camera monitor flickered. We had a few cameras, not enough, but enough to see the fence line in key places. One screen showed a section of chain-link fence near a maintenance gate. The floodlights there were off because they drew attention, and we'd learned attention was dangerous. On the screen, movement appeared, slow, careful. A figure came into view, Then another, not running, crouching, moving in short bursts. I felt my throat tighten. "Get the lieutenant," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The guard sergeant on watch leaned forward, hand going to the radio. Before he could transmit, the camera went dead. Not static, not a glitch, dead black. The sergeant swore. He switched screens. Another camera, a different angle, showed the same area. The infected were there, closer now, and one of them had its arms up near the camera mount. It was covering the lens, blocking visibility. Then the screen went dead too. The sergeant's eyes met mine, and in that look was an understanding we didn't want. They weren't just testing, they were executing. We mobilized fast but carefully. Flashlights stayed off, people moved in pairs, radios were used sparingly. We took positions behind vehicles and barriers, watching the maintenance gate area with night vision optics the guard had brought. In the darkness, we saw shadows moving along the fence line. More than a few, maybe 20, maybe 30. Hard to count when they didn't cluster like a mindless crowd. They approached the maintenance gate, the place where the fence had a hinged section and a lock. A weak point by design, because humans like gates. 2 infected pressed against the gate, not shaking it, but holding it steady. Others moved behind them, staying low. Then, from the side, 3 infected carried something. At first I thought it was a person. My stomach lurched. Then the shape resolved. It was a large plastic barrel, the kind used for trash or storage. They rolled it, then lifted and shoved it forward so it bumped against the gate. A battering tool. They weren't slamming themselves into the fence. They were using an object to absorb force and protect their bodies from immediate injury, while focusing force on the weak point. One of the infected stepped back, and, this part was almost too surreal, kicked the barrel forward. It wasn't a perfect kick, it was clumsy, but it was purposeful. The barrel hit the gate with a dull thud. The lock rattled. They did it again, and again. Not in frenzy, but in repetition. The gate held for maybe 30 seconds, then the lock gave. The gate swung inward. The infected didn't rush. They flowed low and fast into the airport perimeter. We fired, because at that point it was either fire or die. The guard used controlled bursts. Sheriff's deputies fired from behind cover. The sound was sharp and loud, and in the flashes I saw infected drop, bodies folding. But others kept moving, and they didn't move randomly. A group split left, toward the hangars. Another group split right, toward the tower. A smaller set stayed near the gate, as if holding it open. They had a plan. We fell back to our inner perimeter, vehicles arranged in a line, a makeshift barricade in front of the main hangar. People shouted coordinates and directions, trying to keep their voices low but failing. An infected reached the barricade and did something that chilled me more than any violent lunge. It stopped. It stopped at the edge of the vehicle line, and it stared at the gaps, calculating which path would be easiest. Then it stepped sideways, moving along the barricade, looking for a weakness. When it found one, an opening between a pickup and a fuel trailer, it lunged. It wasn't just trying to get to the nearest human, it was trying to get through. We pushed it back with a long metal pole used for moving crates. We didn't let it get close. The infected snapped at the air, then retreated half a step, then came again, learning our reach. Behind it, others did the same, probing, retreating, probing again. It felt like fighting something that could learn your rhythm. We held barely. We lost 2 people in the chaos, not in a way I'm going to describe in detail, because what matters isn't the horror of it. It's that it happened fast and left us with fewer hands, fewer eyes, fewer chances. After 15 minutes of fighting, the infected began to pull back. That wasn't normal. Normal predators don't pull back when they smell blood. Normal, mindless infected would keep pressing until they were destroyed. These pulled back as if they'd achieved an objective. Then the generator yard exploded into noise. Not an explosion like fire, but a sudden rise in sound. Alarms, a horn, a harsh mechanical grinding. Samir, the mechanic, sprinted past me, eyes wide. "They hit the fuel line," he shouted. "They ripped the coupling. There's a leak. The sensors are screaming." The infected had created a breach, forced us to fire and move and panic. And during that panic, they had targeted our infrastructure. New behavior. They weren't just hunting people anymore. They were degrading our ability to survive. If they could keep us in the dark, without power, without fuel pumps, then the airport would become just another trap. We stopped the leak. We shut down the alarms. We stabilized. But we all understood what had happened. The infected had coordinated a raid, and they had learned something else in the process. We would expose ourselves to protect our systems. That meant our systems could be bait. By morning, we made a decision we never wanted to make. We couldn't hold the airport long term. Not because the fence was weak, not because we lacked supplies, but because the infected were adapting at a pace that turned static defenses into liabilities. Every day we stayed, they had time to observe, time to test, time to plan. We needed to move somewhere with layers of distance and fewer approach routes, somewhere with elevation, controlled access, and the ability to watch from above. Somewhere like the old Carry Furnace site along the Monongahela River with its towering structures and limited entrances. Or somewhere like a hilltop water treatment facility. Or the option that made my stomach tighten because it sounded like something from a survivalist fantasy but was painfully practical, the Pittsburgh Water Tower complex on Observatory Hill, near Riverview Park, where height gave you sightlines and the roads up were narrow. We debated in the hangar, voices low, maps spread out. Tessa argued for a facility with water infrastructure because water was life and because treatment plants often had fences, generators, and maintenance buildings. The guard wanted a location that could be defended with minimal manpower and good fields of view. The county emergency manager worried about moving civilians and supplies through streets that were no longer safe. In the end, we chose the Highland Park Reservoir Complex, not because it was perfect, but because it offered a combination we desperately needed. Perimeter walls, elevation, existing utility buildings, and most importantly, fewer ways for the infected to approach unseen. Highland Park had old stone walls, a reservoir basin, maintenance roads, and the kind of heavy gates that weren't meant for crowds. It also had access to water and the potential to manage it. The area around it was still partially populated, which meant risk, but it also meant there might be people we could help and bring into a controlled space. We left the airport in the afternoon, when visibility was best, and the infected seemed less active in open daylight. The convoy was small, 2 guard vehicles, a sheriff's SUV, the box truck, and a couple of civilian pickups loaded with fuel cans and supplies. We moved without sirens, without flashing lights, quietly, like thieves. As we drove through the city, I saw what Pittsburgh had become. Streets that had been busy were now littered with abandoned cars, doors open, trunks half packed. There were signs painted on storefronts, closed, no power, keep out. Some buildings were burned, not engulfed, but scarred, like someone had tried to cleanse something with fire and failed. We passed a row of houses where every porch light was off and every window was covered. In one yard, a child's bicycle lay on its side. The city felt like it was holding its breath. And then, at an intersection near East Liberty, we saw them. They were standing at the corner, 5 infected, spaced out under the shade of a building overhang. They weren't in the middle of the street. They weren't charging traffic. They were positioned like a toll booth in a nightmare, close enough to see, far enough back to avoid being easily hit. As our convoy approached, they didn't rush. They watched, their heads turned, tracking the vehicles. One stepped forward into the sunlight, raised its arm and pointed, not at us, but down a side street as if signaling. A second later, movement appeared at the far end of that side street, more infected. emerging from behind cars, moving quickly toward the intersection. An ambush. The guard driver hit the accelerator. Our convoy surged through the intersection before the side street group could close. A few infected stumbled forward, reaching, but they didn't throw themselves under the wheels like the early ones might have. They backed away as we passed, preserving themselves, preserving assets. My mouth went dry. Tessa's fingers dug into the dashboard. "They're controlling intersections," she said. "Yes," I whispered. "They're building choke points." We reached Highland Park without being fully stopped, but the attempt itself changed something in my mind. It wasn't just that the infected were learning, it was that they were shaping the environment, using the city's structure to their advantage. We entered through a maintenance gate after cutting a chain and pushing it aside. Inside, the reservoir complex was quieter than the city streets, with long sight lines over open basins and thick stone walls that muffled sound. We positioned vehicles to block the gate behind us and moved supplies into a maintenance building that had concrete walls and a solid door. As the sun lowered, we set up an observation point on a higher section of the complex, using binoculars and a spotting scope. From there, we could see the approach roads and parts of the surrounding neighborhood. At first, nothing moved. Then, as if on a schedule, infected began to appear at the edges of the park. Not all at once, not in a wave. One here, then another, then three in a line. They kept to tree lines and shadows, moving between cover. They stopped in spots where they could see the walls and the gate. They were scouting. That night, we kept lights minimal and noise low. We ate cold food. We spoke in murmurs. We moved like we were trying not to wake a sleeping animal. Around 11:30 p.m., I was on watch with a guard corporal named Imani Rhodes. She was younger than me, but she carried herself like someone who'd been forced to grow up quickly, even before the world ended. Through night vision optics, we watched a cluster of infected near the outer wall. They weren't attacking. They were standing with their faces turned toward us, as if they could feel our presence. Then one of them did something I still don't fully understand. It walked to the stone wall and pressed its forehead against it. Not a headbutt, not aggression, just contact. It stayed like that for several seconds, then stepped back. Another infected did the same in a different spot, then another. Imani frowned. "What are they doing?" she whispered. I didn't answer immediately, because my brain was trying to match patterns, pressure, sound, vibration. "They might be listening," I said finally, feeling for activity, for footsteps, for generator vibration, anything. We held still. The infected repeated the behavior in different places along the wall, then moved off into the trees. If that was what it looked like, then they weren't just using eyes. They were using the environment itself as a sensor. New behavior. Over the following days, we built routines. We organized supplies. We established a rotation of watch. We brought in a handful of survivors who approached cautiously, waving cloths, begging to be let inside. We screened them as best we could, looking for fever, confusion, any sign of infection. We quarantined newcomers in a separate room for observation, because that's what you do when you don't know everything, but you know enough to be afraid. We tried to re-establish communication with other pockets of responders. Sometimes we could reach a county dispatch center. Sometimes we could reach a ham radio operator in a rural area who relayed messages like it was 1943. The wider government structure was still there in fragments, but it was stretched thin and moving towards something like triage. Protect critical infrastructure, evacuate what you can, abandon what you can't. And the infected kept changing. They began appearing at dawn and dusk more than midday. They began using shadows like cover. They began moving in staggered spacing, so one loud event wouldn't pull them all into one kill zone. They began avoiding obvious traps, vehicles positioned as barriers, areas where the ground was open and easy to watch. One afternoon, a young survivor we'd taken in, a college student named Marisol Vega, came to me with a shaken look. I saw them, she said. Where? I asked. Down near the playground, she said. In the park. They were practicing. Practicing what? She swallowed. Climbing, she said. They were climbing the jungle gym, not fast, not like kids, but they were learning how to use their arms. I went with her, keeping distance, using binoculars from behind a wall. In the park below, a cluster of infected moved around a metal climbing structure. One grasped a bar, pulled, failed, tried again. Another watched, then tried a different approach, using its leg to hook. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't expert, but it was deliberate repetition. They were training motor patterns. If they could eventually climb fences, walls, barriers that we relied on, then every safe place would become temporary. That night, the mood inside our maintenance building was grim. People tried to pretend they weren't listening. When the guard discussed relocating again, further out, maybe to a rural facility with natural barriers, someone suggested the old tunnels under the city. Someone else dismissed it because tunnels became traps. Every idea had a downside now. And then the infected did something that felt like a message. It happened on the 5th night at Highland Park. We had been quiet. No generator running. No lights visible from outside. We were doing everything right. At 2:05 a.m., the main gate area, blocked by vehicles, made a sound, a soft, metallic scrape, then another. Imani and I moved to our watch position with optics. At the gate, in the dim light, we saw a single infected dragging something across the road. It was a long strip of metal, maybe pulled from a fence or a signpost. The infected dragged it slowly, producing that scraping sound that made your teeth itch. It wasn't trying to break through. It was making noise on purpose. Behind it, in the shadows, other infected stood still, watching the wall. The drag continued for a full minute, then stopped. The infected released the metal and stepped back. Then, from somewhere in the trees, another sound began. A series of sharp knocks, like someone tapping a pipe with a tool. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. It wasn't random, it was patterned. The infected near the gate tilted their heads, listening, then shifted positions as if responding to the knocks. I felt cold spread through my chest. They're signaling, I whispered. Imani didn't answer, but I could feel her tension. The knocks continued for several minutes, then stopped. The infected at the gate turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as if their job was done. They had forced us to listen. They had demonstrated control over noise. They had shown coordination at distance. If they could signal to each other, even in a crude way, then groups could coordinate beyond line of sight. That meant ambushes could be timed. That meant distractions could be synchronized. The next morning, I gathered everyone for a briefing, because if fear is going to exist, it should at least have shape. I explained what we'd seen, without dramatics. I described it like I would describe a workplace hazard, pattern, observation, implication. Some people reacted with denial, some with anger, some with a kind of silent resignation. Samir, the mechanic, stared at his hands. So what do we do? He asked quietly. If they keep learning, what's the end state? I didn't have a comforting answer. Comfort was a luxury we'd already spent. We adapt faster, I said. We stop assuming they're stuck at one level. We build plans that account for change. Tessa added something that became our new guiding rule. Stop thinking of them like weather, she said. Weather doesn't watch you, they watch. The next week was a game of survival chess, except the pieces could change how they moved between turns. We began rotating our defensive patterns so the infected couldn't map them. We changed watch positions. We shifted vehicle barriers. We varied light use. We planted noise decoys away from our actual entry points, not to lure the infected into a trap, but to keep them uncertain. We also began collecting evidence. because evidence was the only tool that could eventually become policy. If we could document the behavior and transmit it to other pockets, maybe they could avoid our mistakes. We recorded short video clips through optics when possible. We wrote detailed logs, time, location, observed actions, and we sent messages whenever we could. Observed infected using objects for noise bait. Observed infected demonstrating coordinated distraction at perimeter. Observed infected avoiding bright lights and open ground using shadows. Observed possible signalling with pattern knocking sounds. Some messages came back from other places. A responder group near Erie reported infected gathering near the entrance of a warehouse, but not attacking until a vehicle approached, then swarming the vehicle route while leaving the building untouched. A group in rural Westmoreland County reported infected lingering near a bridge, as if controlling the crossing. A ham operator relayed a story from Ohio. Infected had been seen standing under a highway overpass during daylight, watching traffic from a shaded position, moving only when vehicles slowed. Every report added weight to the same conclusion. New behavior wasn't isolated. It was spreading or emerging across regions. It wasn't one clever infected, it was a trend. The question that haunted me was why. I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a virologist with a lab. I was a field investigator with a notebook and a worsening sense of dread. But I knew enough biology to understand that pathogens don't decide to become smart. They select for transmission and survival. If increased coordination improved transmission, if it led to more successful attacks, more bites, more spread, then the behaviors that enabled it would become more common. That could happen through multiple mechanisms. It could be a direct effect on brain function, driving certain patterns. It could be indirect, with only those infected surviving longer who behaved in certain ways. It could be both. But whatever the mechanism, the outcome was the same. The threat was no longer static. And then, on a cold grey morning, we got the message that changed our plans entirely. It came over the ham relay, broken by static, but clear enough. A federal coordination group was establishing a secure corridor for evacuation and consolidation west of Harrisburg, using a series of checkpoints and controlled roads. They were gathering remaining medical staff, public safety, and critical personnel to move them to a larger, more defensible site. An old military facility that had been reactivated for emergency use. The site name was code, but the general area was clear. South central Pennsylvania, not far from the mountains. A place with fencing, bunkers, and layers. It wasn't a guarantee of safety. Nothing was now. But it was a chance to join a larger effort, to contribute to something more than a slow siege in a city park. The problem was getting there. Between Pittsburgh and south central Pennsylvania lay two realities: highway corridors that had become evacuation routes and infection routes, and the infected who had begun to understand those corridors. We held a planning session that afternoon. Maps again, fuel calculations, food, medical supplies, risk. We decided to move in smaller units, not a big, obvious convoy. 2 vehicles at a time, separated by distance, meeting at predetermined points. We would travel primarily during midday, when infected activity seemed lower in open spaces, and avoid major intersections and choke points when possible. We'd leave behind anything we couldn't carry. We'd take only what mattered: water, medical gear, radios, fuel, and documents. That night I stood on the reservoir wall and looked out at the city. In the distance, faint fires glowed. Somewhere, a dog barked and then went silent. The wind carried a smell that wasn't quite smoke and wasn't quite garbage, a new urban scent of collapse. I thought about how quickly normal life had broken, how fast the language had changed, how stay home had become do not travel, had become do not make noise, had become assume they're watching. And I thought about the infected, out there in shadows, learning. When we left Highland Park 2 days later, they were waiting, not at the gate, not clustered where we'd expect. They were positioned along the approach road, in the tree line, spaced like sentries. As our first vehicle rolled forward, a sheriff's SUV with a guard driver, one infected stepped into the road, not charging, just blocking. The SUV slowed. The infected didn't attack. It stared through the windshield. Then it stepped aside, letting the SUV pass. But as it did, it tilted its head and made a low sound, not a scream, not a moan, something else, a short, guttural call. From the trees, movement answered. Infected began to move parallel to the road, not toward the vehicle, but alongside, keeping pace through the brush. They were escorting. They were tracking. We didn't stop. We didn't engage. We kept moving, steady speed, no sudden acceleration that might draw more. The infected followed for nearly a mile, then peeled away near a larger intersection, where they stopped under an overpass and watched us go. A checkpoint. A boundary. It felt like passing through territory claimed by something that didn't need flags. We drove east, avoiding interstates when possible, using secondary roads and rural routes. The landscape changed from dense city to rolling hills. Farm fields lay empty. Barns stood quiet. The sky was low and heavy. At a gas station outside a small town, we stopped briefly to siphon fuel from an underground tank using a manual pump the station owner had shown us before he left. We kept the engine noise minimal. We posted lookouts. We moved fast. And still, they found us. An infected appeared at the edge of the lot, half hidden behind a dumpster. It didn't charge. It watched. A second appeared behind a parked box truck, then a third by the tree line. They were not reacting to our sound. We were being located by something else, maybe visual tracking from earlier, maybe scent, maybe pure pattern recognition of humans stop here. We finished the fuel transfer and left. The infected didn't pursue aggressively. They simply watched us depart, as if recording information. The further east we travelled, the more we saw signs that other people had learned the same hard lessons. Houses with blackout curtains, neighbourhoods with makeshift barricades at entrances, hand-painted warnings, quiet zone, do not honk, no lights at night. In one town, a group of survivors had built a barricade of farm equipment across a main road, leaving a narrow gap for vehicles to pass single file. They signalled us through, with hand gestures, no shouting. Their faces were hard, their movements efficient. One of them approached our driver and spoke through a scarf mask, voice low. "Don't stop at intersections," he said. "They gather there." "How do you know?" the driver asked. The man's eyes flicked toward the tree line, then back. "They don't run at cars anymore," he said. "They wait for a reason." We left that town and continued, and the words stayed with me. Wait for a reason. By the time we reached the outskirts of Harrisburg, the sky was turning late afternoon grey. The Susquehanna River cut through the landscape like a dark ribbon. Bridges became critical points, and we approached each one like it might be an ambush. At the first major bridge we intended to cross, we stopped on a hill and watched through optics. The bridge itself looked clear, no cluster of bodies, no visible movement. But at the far end, under the approach ramp, shadows held shapes that were too still to be just debris. Infected. They were positioned where vehicles would slow, near the curve, near the merge, where speed drops naturally. I felt my pulse in my throat. They had learned traffic engineering. We didn't cross, we diverted to a smaller bridge further north, one with less traffic potential, narrower, older. It cost us time and fuel, but it avoided the obvious trap. At the smaller bridge, we saw them again, two infected near the far bank, standing in brush, watching the water. They didn't move when we approached, they didn't charge, they simply watched. And then, as we crossed, one stepped forward and made that low call again. From deeper in the brush, movement answered. They weren't isolated, they were networked. We crossed anyway, because we couldn't stay. The infected began moving along the bank parallel to us, but the water barrier slowed them. They fell behind. For the first time in days, I felt a thin thread of relief. Natural barriers still mattered. That became our new strategy. Use terrain, not just walls. Use rivers, steep grades, open fields, places where spacing and line of sight favored humans. We reached the edge of the federal corridor near dusk. There were signs of organization. Vehicles positioned as controlled barriers, lights shielded downward to reduce visibility, personnel moving with discipline. A checkpoint was set up with concrete barriers and a narrow entry lane. A guard soldier approached our lead vehicle with a flashlight kept low. He asked for identification, for the purpose of travel, for signs of injury. His face was tired, but his eyes were alert. He looked at my badge, then at me. "Public health," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Field investigation." He nodded once. "You've been seeing it?" he asked quietly. "The behavior changes?" I said. He exhaled, a short, bitter sound. "Yeah," he said. "We've been seeing it too." We were allowed through. Inside the corridor, we drove along a controlled route toward the larger site. The facility wasn't named on signs, but you could feel its presence before you saw it. Layers of fencing, watchtowers, vehicles parked in defensive patterns, a sense of concentration. When we finally arrived, the gates opened and closed behind us with a heavy finality that made my chest tighten. For a moment, the sound felt like safety. The facility had been a military training site decades ago, then partially decommissioned, then reactivated in the emergency. Barracks buildings were being used as housing. A large warehouse had been converted into a medical triage center. There were generators, fuel bladders, water tanks, and an actual operations center with maps and working communication. It was the closest thing to a functioning society I'd seen in weeks. And even here, the infected were part of the conversation. In the operations center, I was brought into a briefing with people who looked like they hadn't slept properly since the outbreak began. There were federal emergency managers, military officers, engineers, medical personnel. A whiteboard showed a map of central Pennsylvania with marks indicating secure zones and lost areas. An officer pointed to a cluster of marks along major highway interchanges. "They're congregating here," he said. "Not randomly. These are control points." A public health physician nodded, jaw tight. "We've had reports of coordinated distraction tactics," she said. "They probe perimeters. They test response times." I felt both horror and grim validation. It wasn't just us. It wasn't just Pittsburgh. The pattern was recognized. They asked me to present what we'd observed. I spoke plainly, without drama, because drama didn't help anyone plan. I described the airport raid, the bait radio, the intersection ambush, the wall listening behavior, the patterned knocks, the training at the playground. The room was silent when I finished. Then a man at the back, wearing a plain jacket with no obvious insignia, spoke up. "We've been analyzing video from multiple states," he said. "We believe the behavior shift isn't uniform. It's clustered." "Clustered how?" I asked. He pointed at the map. "Areas with higher density of infected," he said. "More contact between them. More opportunity for observational learning or whatever mechanism is driving this." A military officer rubbed his face. "So the longer a region stays uncontrolled, the worse they get," he said. The man nodded. "That's our working assumption," he said. "Time favors them." Time favors them. That phrase landed like a weight. It meant every delay mattered. Every argument about logistics mattered. Every failure to act decisively gave the infected more opportunity to refine. A plan began to form in that room. Not a heroic plan, not a cinematic one, but a realistic strategy shaped by scarcity. We would prioritize the creation of corridors and strongholds connected by terrain advantages, rivers, ridges, controlled bridges. We would limit travel through predictable choke points, We would reduce noise and light footprint. We would change defensive patterns frequently. We would stop treating the infected like a static threat and start treating them like an adaptive adversary. And there was one more piece. The piece that made my skin prickle. We think they're using sound in a structured way, the man in the plain jacket said. We've recorded repeated patterned noises near perimeters, followed by coordinated movement. Not language, maybe, but signaling. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. A communications specialist raised a hand. "Can we jam it?" she asked. "Can we drown it out?" The officer shook his head. "If we make more noise, we draw more," he said. "We'd be feeding the problem." Silence, then, was not just comfort, it was tactical. That night, assigned a bunk in a barracks room with 8 other exhausted people, I lay on a thin mattress and listened to the facility's muted sounds. Distant generator hum, footsteps in a hallway, a quiet radio call. Outside, beyond the fences, the world was dark. I thought about the infected out there, in the tree lines and intersections, waiting, learning. I thought about how fast behavior had changed, how the early chaos had sharpened into something colder. And I thought about what it meant for the future. If infected could adapt, coordinate, signal, test, and exploit, then the usual arc of outbreak burns out wasn't guaranteed. This wasn't a simple wave. This was a feedback loop. Human defenses would push. Infected behavior would shift. Human tactics would change. Infected would learn again. It was a war of observation, played in streets and shadows. In the weeks that followed, I became part of a small unit tasked with what the operations center called behavioral surveillance. It was a fancy term for a grim job. Gather data from the edge, document what the infected were doing now, and feed that information back into defensive planning. We didn't do raids. We didn't go looking for fights. We moved in small teams to observation points, used optics, recorded, retreated. Our weapons, carried by guard escorts, were there for emergency defense, not for some fantasy of clearing areas. Clearing was too expensive. The infected were too many, and every loud engagement drew more. We traveled by day, used rivers as boundaries, kept vehicles in good condition, rotated routes. On one trip near a highway interchange outside Carlisle, we watched an infected group operate like something between a patrol and an ambush unit. They weren't standing aimlessly. They were positioned in a pattern. 2 near the on-ramp, 3 under the overpass, 1 in the shadow of a billboard support. They watched cars that came through, mostly abandoned vehicles now, but sometimes survivor vehicles trying to move. When a vehicle approached too fast, the infected didn't chase. When a vehicle slowed, the infected moved in, not from one direction, but from multiple, attempting to box it. A survivor sedan approached, creeping. The driver likely thought slow and quiet was safest. The infected responded immediately, converging. The sedan accelerated too late, clipped the curb, and crashed into a barrier. The infected didn't swarm blindly. 2 went to the driver's side. 1 went to the passenger side. 1 stayed behind the vehicle, watching the road. A lookout. The driver managed to climb out the passenger side and run. The infected pursued, but not all. 2 pursued. The others remained, as if keeping control of the interchange mattered more than one fleeing person. That told me something important. They were prioritizing territory, not just prey. On another trip, we observed them using elevation. Infected stood on the 2nd story of a parking garage, behind broken concrete, watching the street. When movement appeared, they signaled with that low call, and infected below shifted. They were using vantage points. They weren't building structures, but they were using structures like tools. The most unsettling observation came a month after the outbreak began, when we set up near a suburban cul-de-sac that had been abandoned. It was late afternoon. The sun made long shadows. An infected group moved into the neighborhood, slow and deliberate. They approached a house with boards over windows. They didn't attack the boards. They walked around the perimeter, pausing at each window, each door listening. One pressed its ear against the wood like a person trying to hear through a wall. Then they moved to the next house and did the same. House to house, methodical. Search behavior. They weren't just reacting to noise now. They were conducting systematic sweeps, looking for hidden humans. When they found nothing, they didn't rage, they didn't destroy. They moved on, conserving energy. It was like watching a patrol clear rooms, except it was happening in a neighborhood, and the patrol had no uniforms and no words. When I reported that back at the facility, the operations team didn't argue with me. They didn't dismiss it as overinterpretation. They simply added it to the planning board and adjusted guidelines. Assume they can search quietly became a line in the new shelter advisories, which meant that hiding alone in a boarded house, once the go-to survival fantasy, was becoming less viable over time. Time favors them. I began to understand that survival was no longer about, say, a single stronghold. It was about mobility combined with terrain, about staying unpredictable, about avoiding patterns the infected could map. It was also about communities learning to operate quietly, not just be silent, but be uninteresting. No consistent generator hum, no nightly lights at the same time, no predictable routes. The infected, whatever they were now, were pattern hunters. And humans, by nature, love patterns. We cook at the same time. We gather at the same places. We travel predictable roads. We turn on lights when it gets dark. We respond to noises. We were the easiest prey imaginable, until we changed. Over the next months, the facility became a node in a growing network of nodes. River towns connected by boat travel. Hilltop installations connected by narrow, controlled roads. Rural communities that used fields and distances to see threats coming. Not everywhere survived. Many places went quiet and never sent another signal. But enough did that the map of human presence didn't go to zero. It became a patchwork. And the infected remained in the spaces between, evolving in their own patchwork, with some areas showing more advanced behaviors than others. Places that had been densely infected for longer became more dangerous in ways that weren't about numbers, but about tactics. One afternoon, a team returned from an observation trip shaken. Their leader, a former state trooper named Mike Donnelly, sat with me in the briefing room and spoke in a low voice. "We saw them do a handoff," he said. "A handoff?" I asked. He nodded, face tight. A group was moving along a road. They approached a crossroads. Another group was already there. They didn't collide. They didn't fight. They merged. And one individual from the second group peeled off and went down a side road, like it was sent on assignment. Sent. I wrote it down, my pen pressing hard. "That's coordination," I said. Mike's eyes flicked toward the door, as if he didn't want anyone else hearing. "It felt like organization," he said. "Not a crowd, something else." I didn't know what to call it. Pack wasn't right, unit felt too human, but the function was unmistakable. They were distributing themselves. They were managing coverage. It reminded me, horribly, of the way police units position in a city, how they respond to radio calls, how they shift resources. Except here, the calls were knocks and low guttural sounds, and whatever signals we still couldn't decode. By midsummer, the facility leadership had a new priority, preventing the infected from reaching a certain threshold in any region. If time and density increased behavior complexity, then containment wasn't just about stopping spread. It was about preventing concentrations that could become smart zones, areas where the infected could coordinate so effectively they could threaten even hardened sites. That led to difficult choices. It meant abandoning some areas entirely, to avoid fighting losing battles. It meant focusing on defending key corridors and letting everything else go dark. It meant decisions that would haunt anyone with a conscience. I tried not to drown in the moral weight, because if you drown, you're useless. I focused on the work I could do. Observation, documentation, guidance. One evening, as the sun set beyond the hills and the facility lights stayed low, Tessa found me on the edge of the perimeter fence. We stood looking out at the tree line, the world beyond like a black ocean. "You remember the first days?" she asked softly. I nodded. "They were loud," she said, "like a riot, like chaos." "Now they're quiet," I said. "Yeah," she whispered, "now they're quiet." In the distance, far beyond the fence, a faint sound carried on the wind. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Not close, not immediate, but out there, somewhere, the infected were signaling in the dark. And the scariest part wasn't that they could do it. It was that, as weeks turned into months, the patterns became more consistent, more refined, as if they were improving their own communication. New behavior wasn't a phase. It was progression. That understanding changed everything about how we plan to survive. We stopped thinking in terms of when this ends and started thinking in terms of how we live alongside an evolving threat. We built quiet communities. We used rivers and ridges. We trained children to move silently. We taught newcomers that noise was as dangerous as fire. We learned to travel like ghosts. And still, the infected watched. They watched from shadows and overpasses. They waited at intersections and bridges. They probed fences with objects and tested reactions with sound. They learned. I don't know how far that learning can go. I don't know if there is a ceiling, a biological limit beyond which they can't climb. Maybe there is. Maybe this is the peak and we're seeing the worst of it. But I do know this, because I've seen it too many times to deny. The infected are not the same as they were at the beginning. They display new behavior. And if we survive, it will be because we accept that reality every single day. Because the day we assume they're simple again is the day we become predictable. And predictable in this world is just another word for gone. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.